Hi, so I would just like to start off with a fun fact, and that's if we all had a nickel for each time a French ruler died by hitting their head on a doorway, we would all fortunately be 10 cents richer. So, while you fact check me on that, I would just like to go over my purpose and my credibility, which is that I hope that I can persuade you, the audience, to treat history with more importance, and as someone who considers history a hobby, and has for years floated through reading books, watching movies, and doing independent research, I would just love for you to try to do the same. And I'll be doing that by talking about how history can help you read modern events. History is also very important to preserve. And then also, I would like to talk about some more approachable ways of getting into researching history. So, I would just like to start by saying that history has often helped many people read modern events and see where something could happen. And the MOOC blog team in Why Is It Important to Study History talks about how, from climate inaction to genocidal events, it can often be traced back to people just understanding the situation. And it's very important to do that because as it takes shape, you could also look at the past and see how similar events have folded and how they have gone. And so, for an example of mine, is the Russo-Ukrainian War, where Russia was building up troops along the borders of Ukraine. I could tell that something was going to happen, whether it was going to be some world stage political event or if it was going to be what it turned out to be, a war. And so that's a very unfortunate thing, but a lot of people could see the trends that it was taking and seeing that it was going in that direction. And as someone who follows history, I was one of those people that could tell. And then past that, it's also very important to be able to read history on a more not world stage level, but also on a more national level, because it always helps to know trends from politicians and modern politics, which you can often look at history as a source or as a way to get ideas on what's going to happen. So Peter Stearns from the American Historical Association talks about how whether it was the Great Depression or other major historical events that involved politicians, you can normally trace those events back to some policy or something that took shape beforehand to figure out what caused that. And it helps to do that because to be a more informed citizen, it's very helpful to be able to influence the people that make those decisions whenever you're not the person that's able to do that. But that's not the only important thing about history, just being able to read events, but it's also very important to learn from it, which is something that we do by preserving history. So for a very long time, we as humanity didn't know how to write down and record our history. And Walter Stevens from Literary Hub talks about how the history of writing is the history of humanity. And I firmly agree with that because had we not been able to start writing down and recording our history, we would, one, not learn anything from our ancestors, and two, the long processes that we learned over time to advance ourselves would be significantly slower and would be a lot more stagnant because it's a very complicated process and it would take a lot more mental ability from the average person. So yeah, that's one of the major importances of preserving history. And then Ray Rickman from Roger Williams University talks about how even though we have very harmful history, it's very important to preserve it because in the case where he talks about the lawless Wild West, the violence of the civil rights movement, where there was a lot of racial violence that led up to it, and all of the painful history that the United States has had, if we were to forget that, then we, as the age-old saying says, are doomed to repeat it. So there's a lot of importance to preserving history, and that's one of the more important things about it, just being able to learn from the people that came before us and being able to read into what they did so we know how to act nowadays. Now, that sounds probably very intimidating. I won't lie about that. But I would also like to talk about more digestible and more approachable ways of getting into history, whether as a hobby or as someone like me who does a little bit of research in my own free time. And Armella Scona writes in 8 Fascinating Ways to Learn History about how, she talks about 8 different ways, but one that I noticed in particular that she wrote about was movies. And historical movies, even though they aren't the most accurate, are often a very, very approachable way for new people to get into looking at history. And let's say you watch a movie and you really, really click with the topic or the era that it's set in, so you're more inclined to go through the process of researching it on your own. An example of mine would be the movie 1917, which is a movie set in World War One, which is obviously very, very different from World War Two, and that was what drew me to it. So the whole level of political intrigue and everything that led into that was very, very helpful for me getting into it. And I would just like to say that that's one major topic that I've gotten into, but I've also gotten wildly into the early modern era, which is where, for lack of a better term, knights with firearms, pirates, pilgrims, all of that was happening all between the years of 1500 and 1700, and it's one of the more wild eras of history, and I would love for you to look at that. But it's not just those eras that I would love for you to look at, but I would also want you to really take in everything I've said, and I would love for you to get into history. And I hope that whenever I've talked about how it can help read modern events, it can help preserve history, and it's also a little fun to get into, that you're more inclined to become a part of the more historical community, if you get what I'm saying. But yeah, thank you for watching.